Is a presentation sponsored by the Image Text MFA at Cornell University. We're also Image Text Ithaca Press. We're a low residency MFA that brings together writers and image makers of various sorts. And every year, our graduating class has a thesis show, and as part of that thesis show, they do a collective publication. And every year we have a visiting faculty member who assists with the students and basically teaches a kind of curatorial unit and also works on this collective press project. And this year we are so excited that our visiting faculty member was Meg Onli of the Whitney Museum, and I'm gonna have Nicholas do a proper introduction in a minute. And Lucy Ives is joining us to help with this conversation. Lucy has been a frequent faculty member in our program, and I will do a proper introduction of Lucy as well. Maybe I'll just do that right now, and then I'll pass the mic to you. I'm in this sort of, I feel like I'm kind of hunkered down by the mic. Great, so I'm gonna read some of Lucy's bio. If I can open my phone. Come on. All right. Lucy Ives is the author of 3 novels, Impossible Views of the World, published by Penguin Press and selected as a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, Loudermilk, or The Real Poet, or The Origin of the World, published by Soft Skull Press and also a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, and Life is Everywhere, published by Grey Wolf Press and a Best Book of 2022 with The New Yorker and the Seattle Times, and one of my favorite novels of all time. I love this book. Her short fiction is collected in Cosmogony, also an amazing book. Soft Skull Press, 2021. In spring 2020, Siglio Press published The Saddest Thing Is That I Have Had to Use Words, a Madeline Gins reader, the first definitive anthology of poet-architect Gins's poetry and prose, edited and with an introduction by Ives, and I think probably on the table at Siglio here. A great book also. Ives' writing has appeared in many journals, which I won't name. For 5 years, she was an editor with the online magazine Triple Canopy. A graduate of Harvard and the Iowa Writers' Workshop, she holds a PhD in comparative literature from New York University. She was the 2023-25 Bonderman Assistant Professor of the Practice in Literary Arts at Brown University and received a 2018 Creative Capital Andy Warhol Foundation Writers Grant. A book of essays, this is my last thing, an Image of My Name Enters America, was released by Grey Wolf Press in October 24 and won the 24 Vermont Book Award in Creative Nonfiction. Please welcome Lucy Ives.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Catherine Standen. To introduce Meg, who has so generously worked with us and our students over the past 9 months, for which we are very grateful, and it was a great pleasure. Meg Onli is the Nancy and Fred Poses Curator at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. Onli has worked as a curator at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia and is director and curator of the Los Angeles Underground Museum. She has curated such exhibitions as Colored People Time, Mundane Futures, Quotidian Pasts, Banal Presents, and Jessica Vaughn, Our Primary Focus is to Be Successful. She has spoken of her work as, quote, attending to the intricacies of race and the production of space. She co-curated the 2024 Whitney Biennial alongside Chrissy Isles and is currently completing a show, a Lichtenstein show.
Yes.
And I will leave it to the two of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
The book is green, and we think of it as a radical reissue of Mary Shelley's 1826 apocalyptic novel that felt to Meg, as she proposed the project to us, very timely. And so she worked with the artists in the program to create interventions, both visual and textual, into the original text, which is published in full here, but also sometimes blockaded, interrupted, and otherwise brought into a different present.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and thank you to Nicholas and Catherine for inviting me to partake in this project, and also to the readers today, the 4 readers that we have, as well as everyone who's contributed to the book. And I also want to thank Lucy for being here and being an interlocutor with me today. So really appreciate you.
No problem. I'm so delighted to be here and to have learned about this publication, and I'm very excited to talk about it with you. And I have questions, so maybe we should just jump right into that.
Does it feel like we're on a podcast right now?
It does.
It does. It
Yeah.
does. It does.
Yeah, we are a little bit on a
Yeah.
podcast, but so I love image text. That's not a secret, and I wanted to ask you first, if this is okay, if this is not too sudden to jump into this, but I wanted to ask you about the experience of teaching
Yep.
in this program, and sort of how you thought about your teaching in the class that you were doing, and this project.
Yeah, the first time I encountered image text was actually in this building at Print and Matter years ago, pre-pandemic. I don't even remember what year now, but before the pandemic. And a good friend of mine actually participated within the program during the pandemic. So I had kind of a clear sense. I think I have like 3 or 4 books before I got involved. And when Catherine and Nicholas reached out to me, I'm like, what was happening 9 months ago? I think we were still in the biennial in some way. And they proposed to me, like, what's something you haven't been able to do? Which I have to say, if you're going to ask me to do something, that might be the best pitch to ask. And so I had initially had already done an open source, book in 2019 for Color People Time, and that was Sutton Griggs's Imperium and Imperio. And so that book had been public domain. It was written in 1899. It's a Black futurist. A lot of people consider it like the first Afrofuturist speculative novel, and I actually really loved the process. Also to say that this book is designed by Studio Ella, who this is our 9th year working together, and this is our 9th book. And so they had also done this previous iteration. And so I had this kind of like side niche of having this interest in publishing speculative novels from the 1800s with no reason, just simply being guided by interest in it. And so when I was asked to kind of join in the process, it's daunting, to make a group exhibition. It's something I care deeply about, and I know Chrissy Ives is here with us, so I keep looking at her, who's also a fantastic thematic curator. And so how do you work with a group of 13, 14 people who are at this stage in their career? They don't want to be defined necessarily in this like really restrictive way, but how do you provide something that's kind of open and capacious enough for them? And so I pitched this idea of us reading The Last Man together, and wondering how people kind of felt about that. And I knew it's something that I wanted to be the book, but might not be the show. And one of the reasons I leaned towards The Last Man was, it's incredibly long. It is like a very long book. It's very capacious, and there's lots of moments that I feel as if really lends itself to image making, and that can be the mundane, that can be the everyday. You have these long descriptions of what a field might look like, and so I thought, having looked at everyone's website or online presence, I was like, I think every person could do something in relationship to that. And then from conversations with everyone, we ended up growing that a little more into the exhibition, which is Collective Study, that closes today at Microscope Gallery. And it's not necessarily about The Last Man, but it uses this kind of prompt of what does it mean to read collectively together, to study collectively. And maybe the last thing I'll say is, I actually love reading with people. I don't know about you, Lucy, but like I read with a lot of people. A group of curators at the museum I read with. My brother and I are reading a book right now. My best friend and I often read a book together. And so it's not uncommon that I'm in like multiple impromptu reading groups, just being like, hey, are you interested in this book? Do you want to read this? But I read a lot more contemporary literature. And so this was also like a total step into something else that I don't typically do or typically read. It's a really different voice. But it also felt really prescient to engage with material that felt like it was just after a pandemic. And it was something that I felt really strongly during the biennial, that everyone was still coming out of this, and it felt as if the pandemic was over, but we're all still very much living in the wake of it. And so I felt like this might be a book that could really speak to the moment. And of course, it's 200 years old as of next year, and so it felt very timely.
Right, yeah. And it's also a novel that in some ways it's a little bit lost,
Yeah.
right? Like it was published a bit. So there were 2 English editions, there was a French edition, and then there was a pirated American edition because of the way that copyright laws worked in the 19th century that was published, I think, in 1833 in the US. But then it didn't come back into print in the US until 1965. So it's kind of like Mary Shelley's lost work in a certain way. And I wondered if maybe you wanted to tell us a little bit about the plot for anyone who's not familiar with it, or just it's complicated.
It's
but
complicated, yeah. I recommend Wikipedia if you're trying to find the full plot, but it follows, our last man, Lionel, who is surviving post-plague in the 21st century, and throughout it could use a lot of editing. I thought about that in reading the book, and I'm
Maybe
not trying
some
to
cuts
discourage people from reading the book, but it's interesting sometimes to engage with a book that also really tries you, and I think there's a place of it made me feel so much about what our current attention spans were versus what they probably used to be. I mean, even just the writing process for Shelley to actually produce this novel. And so, throughout the book, Lionel has survived, this plague, is living in the aftermath, is contemplating, love, what his future is, desolation, loneliness, like all of these things felt really similar to the place that we're in, particularly through like digital isolation. And so it felt like an echo in certain ways. And it made me realize, in prepping for this talk, I didn't realize just like how much speculative fiction is such a part of particularly American literary tradition, and not just like historically, but like if you think about really popular books, let's say Colson Whitehead, Underground Railroad, so many of those books are actually speculative fictions. And what does that mean as like, this isn't an American book, but to be something that's been taken up so much within America. And I think within Imperium and Imperio, one of the things I was really drawn to this book, which is significantly shorter, is that the book is actually about a group of people who are trying to make a society inside the United States, but they copy the United States at the border between Mexico and Texas. And all of this was happening during the last Trump administration. And so part of me is interested in these ideas of like failed projects of futurity. Like as we think about what the future could look like, there's all of these things that have also like fumbled or failed that have produced who we are today. And this is a slight tangent, but while I was working on Color People Time, I got really interested in Henrietta Lacks and the Gila sales, and a lot of that came up for me in 2012 or something when Rebecca Skloot's book came out. I was working at Northwestern, and that was like the read together book, and I read it.
Yeah.
And while we were thinking about this idea of like a mundane future, it really brought me back to think about, the material of a Black female body. This is something that's actually produced futurities for so many people through vaccines, in vitro fertilization, cloning. I mean, there's so many things that this material actually has produced. And so when I talk about these ideas of failed futures, they're not necessarily failed either. They're just different models that one can pick up and one can look back to. And so I think to me, The Last Man, it's kind of less about like the entire plot of the book than it is really about some aspects of the journey and what it means within the book to suddenly zoom in. And sometimes it feels like the plot kind of fumbles a little bit. You're like, wait, where were we going with this? Or I really thought we'd get a longer description of what was actually happening here. And you're like, a leaf. And having that moment to really focus on, I think the people who have read the book.
Something to grasp. There's a sense of things washing over you sometimes, like I mean, boats and shipwrecks for the Shelley family sort of always seem to be present a little bit, but
But you've read the book before.
I have, and I'm not really sure why
I was
this
gonna say what
happened,
brought
but
it
I probably in the course of getting a PhD, I read this in a class, and I don't, I also don't have very specific memories of like a single thing in the novel. But one of the things that strikes me about the novel is the concern about children and their survival and like harm to children and the deaths of children and how we cope with that. And so that, I mean, that's something that I think about in relation just to, Mary Shelley's biography and her family, and how, in that family, childbirth was not, it was not something that happened with great success. In a way, there's something about you mentioned in your introduction, I was going to save this up, but in your foreword, actually, you described Mary Shelley's ambition with this novel as being to chart the apocalypse not as a spectacle, but as an intimate collapse, personal, political, and planetary. And I think, for me at least, like if this, this book's success, and there's also a way in this that this book is a failure, too, but this book's success seems to lie in the ways in which it's able to understand the tragedy of the loss of a child, or like the loss of your mom, also as being something that has repercussions for the collective, or that it wants to think about those things in a collective way.
I know we have to switch to a video in just a moment, but I think it'd be interesting for us to talk about it as a failure, but also just background. I also lost my parent this year, and so I appreciate it, but like being drawn towards a book like this, I think there's moments of being on like the process of healing. You're like, oh, there's certain things you're like drawn towards, and this book really is that, how does one deal with grief, but how do you deal with mass grief at the same time? But I know we're turning over to a video really quick and some reading. thank you so much to Monica, Marie, Danielle, and Catherine. I'm coming back maybe to the first question you asked, which was about working with a program like this. I've taught before, but mostly within art history programs, or I'd say studio programs that are much more sculptural heavy, painting, things like that. And this one is just so unique and so different to anything else. And I think it is that marriage between, I'm going to say broadly image making. I know there's a lot of photographers, even though not everyone is a photographer within the group, but also this deep interest and investment within text and poetry. And I've been really, I was really surprised throughout a lot of the process. I didn't think there would be this sense of wanting to collectively make something. I think when that came back and people were like, hey, I'm thinking about, maybe making something with a group, I was like, what? Like, I don't normally experience that with MFA students. And, especially, if you're thinking about making something and how do you get into a gallery and how do you get that shown into, a museum? And instead this group was like, I found it just really touching of how much people wanted to collaborate with each other and also really wanted to be within the text. Like how much time, Catherine, especially, your book, thinking about Mary Shelley as a character and sort of being part of taking up her voice, I thought was really interesting. And so I will say this was a really different project that I'm typically working on with, MFA students, master students. I also work with curatorial students. And so it is very much engaged with like producing the show. And although we also produce the show in a book, it felt so much more around like collective interrogation of the book. And as you're opening it, I think were we talking earlier and you said something about it being like a definitive edition and I was like, well, there's also lots of things you can't read in the book. And so
that part.
What happens when, I think about this now curating of like, what do you need to do in a catalog when you can view anything online? Like not everything, but working on Roy Lichtenstein right now, I'm like, you can find almost any image you want online. So how do you represent that in a catalog? And so as we started working on this book, it was really interesting, like every person took a different approach. There's a flip book, you totally obscure pieces, there's photography, there's, concrete poetry, there's music within it. And so I think, again, thinking about this as like, it's an exhibition in itself in a book, and it also really allows a kind of capacious form of thinking and collaboration, which I really appreciate about public domain material. I mean, they are kind of unconsensual collaborations with Mary Shelley.
Yeah. So when you say that they're unconsensual collaborations, would that mean that there are representations of scenes in the book that are part of these interventions? Are the interventions sometimes like redacting parts of the book or maybe improving them for us? Like, can you give some examples of different ways that the material that we see collected here or brought together in this space is sort of like with the text or amplifying the text in ways in which it might be doing things that the text has no idea about?
And we have lots of artists in the audience too, so I think if anyone has strong feelings, you can also interject about your intentions.
Yeah.
I find from looking at the book, myself as an editor, I think there's a lot of like poetic resonance within it. I don't necessarily feel as if the works are illustrating necessarily an exact moment in the book. And I think, Monica, you might have been one of the first people that said, like, I really want to begin with the cave. And that was something that's really interesting to me. While working on the book, I also did studio visits with everyone. So I had a chance to really see people's works, and I could see why that resonated with you kind of immediately. And so some people felt like, I know exactly what I want to do in this book, and this resonates. I'm going to make something in relationship to it. I don't find any of it to be particularly illustrative. I think and I think that's something that I like, at least around this group of artists that I have found, is like this real investment within poetry that feels like it's actually a little bit looser, feels a little more like a dance. And then there's works in the book that I don't find always exact direct references, but I can find the sentiment within the text that it's near. And so I don't know if there's anyone feels, Maddie, I'm actually thinking about you in relationship to your contribution in the book. Do you feel more directly in response to the text?
I feel like I used it just as sort of a point in which to kind of continue thinking about what might happen like outside of the text of the page. So kind of speculating on certain parts of the book. I have a question.
Yeah.
Can I jump to questions?
You're
I have a question before I lose.
Okay, yeah.
Just the question is about maybe Dirk or Lucy, and so maybe with either of you. Thinking about the grief in the book, the grief of the last year, the grief that the students were encountering both individually and
Yeah.
collectively. And wondering what is it a book can do? What is it a book that shows us these kinds of interventions can do in relation to that? Just really, and I'm not looking for, sort of simple singular answer, but it's just something that's been very weighing on me. What is this? What is this that's happening?
Well, I was trying to think about a way to ask Meg a question about this also, and I had selected a passage to read,
Oh, yeah.
and I'll sort of like dip in and out of it, and it comes from the third part of the book, so this is sort of like the apocalypse has happened at this point. And the narrator, who is Lionel, but who is also in some ways a sort of artificial construct, says, have any of you, my readers, observed the ruins of an anthill immediately after its destruction? At first, it appears entirely deserted of its former inhabitants. In a little time, you see an ant struggling through the upturned mold. They reappear by twos and threes, running hither and thither in search of their lost companions. Such were we upon earth, wondering aghast at the effects of pestilence. Our empty habitations remained, but the dwellers were gathered to the shades of the tomb. And this is a very, it's a very disturbing kind of empty image that's presented, and it's like a classical image, because this is like after the war, Virgil's like, check it out, insects do this, this very classical image. And the text goes on, though, to reflect on the ways in which, people died, their corpses, people did pathetic things before they died. But also we see signs that people tried to live, and so that there were people who were impoverished previous to the plague, and that these people then, because there's such an excess of stuff in the human world, and that's something that Mary Shelley is really reflecting on. She's like, look at all this stuff that we have if we don't have people. That people took up things. They took up residence in, sumptuous apartments is a, phrase that's used. So there's a sense of the world being turned upside down and emptied out also leads to new relationships happening. And I would be cautious about proposing this as some kind of answer or some kind of recompense for the loss that takes place. But I think in the same way that the loss is inevitable, these kinds of transformations are also inevitable, and they lead to something else, I think is the suggestion. So and I wanted to ask you about, your thoughts on that.
I think, there's so much around it. Some of it came from, so first off, I should say that I've been wanting to work with this book for, maybe 5 years at this point. And it was finding the right moment. This definitely feels like the right moment to work on this text, but I also think there's a place where when you work on projects that feel timely, they're always timely. These are things that could be reintroduced, 5 years from now, and you could find resonance with, or 5 years before. But while we were working on our biennial, Chrissy and I talked a lot about the apocalypse, and which had nothing very much to do with our show, but we had talked a lot about how do you frame the end of the world. And I went back and read every Whitney biennial catalog from the annuals 1932 first biennial catalog's like 73, and then they really shift in like 89. And when you read it, I'm not the only one that feels this way. Rujeko comments on this in her catalog essay, but like you feel like you're watching the fall of the U.S. Like every year you're like, how worse, every 2 years, how worse could this be? This is what's happening right now. We're destabilized. And to look back at that it's kind of daunting. But it also, you know, one of the things we kind of came back to was just like, the world has ended for so many people. I mean, the world has ended for so many different people. And how do you represent that? How do you hold that in a way? And I think because of the actual temporal distance in Shelley's book, it allows you space to, a space to really feel that, and then also have a perspective of where we are right now. So thinking about the anthill, it makes me think so much about like what it means to be on social media right now and watching atrocity regularly. How do we, I mean, I'm from Los Angeles, and so I think a lot about media, and I work a lot within video, and so a lot of the artists I know are responding to constructs of the media, and how much of my life I've actually experienced major events through a screen. Like, I experience most of those things now through a screen. And so I think for this, there's moments in the book that just feel very close and near, even if, you know, the mediation is different. And it also points to, like, this is life, and this is the cycle of things are. They're chaotic. They feel incredibly chaotic right now. But I think returning to something that also, you know, is 200 years old, is fiction, you know, but is coming from a place of reality, and is coming from a place of, you know, Mary Shelley and her, you know, imagining what this world could be that feels very similar to like what we actually are in right now. And so there's a place for me that I feel like, you know, within the book, and particularly the responses that everyone had, they weren't these like one-to-one, you know, but it was much more the untangible feeling of those things feel very present.
Yeah, that there is a kind of, the book sort of sets out to be an allegory, like it's a giant allegory. I mean, I guess Mary Shelley was hanging out with poets or something, and you know, something rubbed off there. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about you know, being a curator and working with literature, and what you think the possibilities are for that. It's a very open question. So,
you know, it's really interesting. A lot of my work engages with poetry and text, and it has actually really surprised me. I was just talking this morning to my wife, who is a literary professor, and we were talking about books we loved as children, and I had none. I didn't have any. I was not a reader, and I actually really struggled reading. And so I didn't actually read for myself until my 20s. Like, my grandmother read to me for most of my life, and I was diagnosed as dyslexic, and it was actually something I really had to learn as an adult. And I think through that process, because it had been such a challenging terrain for me, I've been really surprised at how many of my exhibitions actually engage with, at least loosely inspired by, experimental poetry. And I think part of that is from finding a love for certain texts. I'm a capacious reader now, and read a lot, but I think part of it is also being like, there isn't a world, yes, that you can escape to, which I really love from reading, but I also think there's a place of, how do I say this, like the hard-won fought, like hard-fought won, you know, being able to be like, this is actually something that's been incredibly challenging for me, but I have to harness language all the time in my job. You know, writing is a big aspect of my job. I read a lot, and I think a lot of that ends up coming into my work in certain ways, more so than probably anything else. But I also think, because I'm interested in experimental poetics, it is a really spatial practice at the same time. And thinking about, I think when we were hanging something, I think, Maddie, again, I think it was you that I said, you know, think about the musicality of hanging, where the silence is. And I got that from watching Helen Molesworth hang. She talked about it in relationship to music. But it's, you're understanding in a way that a typesetter is, you know, the negative plus the positive, how things are really fitting with each other. And I always say, like, I've never actually really been good at anything until curating. And so it's such a weird thing to suddenly find out about yourself. It's something I cared deeply about. But like, I had never, till my first show, like, I never curated before, you know, it just was like, I did it. And I was like, oh, wow, I'm actually pretty good at this. But then I got terrified because I was like, well, maybe I'm only good because I, you know, use this architecture. Or like, I think there's a way in which, and this is a long way of saying, education in the United States is just so troubled. It's so hard for people who don't necessarily learn in a really linear fashion. And so I'm surrounded by lots of people who are incredibly brilliant, and many of them have learned in these really linear ways, but like, I'm not that person. I learn a lot through conversations with people, and I think anyone who's worked on this project knows, like, I could talk to them forever about anything. Like, I love talking about ideas. I love engaging with text. I love talking with artists. All of these things are deeply collaborative. And then we have to make it look good. And I actually, you know, controversial, I believe in beauty in many ways, I know. But I also love being in space. And Chrissy, you said Dan Graham was like, it's called a show for a reason. Like, you got to strut your stuff. It has this like other, and the same way that writing does, you know, it's like, it has its own practice. It has its own discipline, but it's also something that, even though I partake in pedagogical projects in curatorial practice, I actually think it's totally an oral history. I think it's something that you experience when you're in space with other curators, and even us being together, lots of us weighed in on, you know, how something felt, how something looked. There's a difference of something being exact versus what feels right. It's so much that's intuited. And so I feel as if we don't often have times to explore that within school. And like, when you discover that, it really like radically changed my orientation towards learning in a lot of ways. And I also think there's lots of places that you can allow. I think what works really well with this group of people is no one is defined by Mary Shelley's The Last Man. Every person has their own individual practice, and yet at the same time, the works gel together because they have all been making within community over the past 2 summers, something like that. Like, there is this resonance. And I went back yesterday to see the show one last time, and I noticed Genevieve, I think it was your publication that came together. I don't know if calling you the sole author is appropriate, but how much collaboration went into that publication of having different copy editors, having different people design the book. Like, you guys are all making work collectively together. And I think I just found that like deeply moving in a moment in which so much is about the individual. It like genuinely surprised me. Like, I've said it over and over again to people, like, it has really surprised me how much this group has wanted to support and make things together. And this is a slight tangent, but I had worked with the artist Ulysses Jenkins on a retrospective, and one of the things I was really drawn to was his collaborations with David Hammonds and Senga Noguchi and Maren Hassinger. And, you know, all of this, they went through art school. They went through competitive art schools. They were at, you know, Cal Arts. They were at Otis. And at one point I asked them, like, they were all showing up in each other's work. They were supporting each other. I mean, even for the catalog, they'd just say, anything Ulysses wants, we will be here for him. And you could feel that energy in the work, you know? You could feel that collectivity. And we traveled that show to Berlin, and I got notes from people being like, you don't see work quite like that anymore. Like, what it meant to be part of a collective, and a collective of people who disbanded and had their own individual practices. And, you know, sometimes you're like, you're all doing sand painting. Were you having a conversation? They're like, no, we just picked up doing sand painting at the same time. It's not competitive. Maybe they're not, you know, maybe they're cleaning their history a little bit up. But, you know, I think there's a place where that really resonates to me. And I think, you know, coming from an art school, being really invested in artist practices in that type of way, I'm so much more interested in that, like, lived experience of creating something that feels like very embodied, while still being interested in theory. But like, that to me feels like it really resonates within a space.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the book, somehow the bound book, is also like providing cover for something too.
Totally.
And it's a really beautiful thing. And what you're saying also makes me think that the sort of the implications of concretism just haven't been exhausted yet in the ways that modernism maybe has. And that, I think that's something for us all to, you know, think about as we're, you know, making work. And the things that you're saying about learning are very moving too, about, you know, what's possible when we work in an interdisciplinary way, like how we can use our minds in ways that maybe would not be accepted in other contexts. So it's very
Totally.
cool.
I do not have any children, and I have lots of godchildren in my life, but lots of my friends' kids are just starting like first grade or things like that, and when they're struggling in school, sometimes they'll be like, man, they're like struggling, or they got held back, and I was like, dude, I was held back in school. I was like, I barely graduated, like, they're gonna be fine, you guys are such loving parents, and you're trying all of these things, like, I guess I used to live in Philly for 5 years, so Crystal will get this, trust the process. Process didn't work for Philly, but, you know, I think there's a place where, you know, I always say I'm a late bloomer. I just said this to my cousin who's like being a late bloomer, figuring out your time, but it is hard when like you have such a structure of school and that's how you're supposed to succeed. But I think through curatorial practices or doing these types of collective projects, it just allows you to experiment, try something, figure out maybe something that works for you in different ways. And so I'm deeply appreciative to be able to have engaged on a project like this. And I also really appreciate having worked with so many interesting artists at the same time at really different places in your guys' lives, but each person brought something totally different into this project. And I really appreciated like the attention to, this feels like kind of a heavy lift, you know, it's not a quick book you can just breeze through. The book itself is, you know, I mean, this is a sculpture onto its own.
Yeah, it is.
You know, it really is a sculpture. And I do just want to shout out Studio Ella, who are just fantastic designers. And I always say I work with them because if I got hit by a bus, I know they'd make a good book. We're really easy to work with because we've known each other for so long, and they can just jump in. They're also professors on their own, so they understood what it was like to actually work with students and really get a sense of collectively what people were making. But yeah, I love a thing, you know? I love objects. That's the reason I do the thing that I do. And so yeah, this book really like lends itself to that as well.
Yeah. Should we take some questions,
Yeah.
if there are any questions out there?
Chrissy.
Well, just first of all, congratulations to everyone. It's a very, very beautiful book, and it's an incredibly sophisticated way of creating something that's both image and text and object put at the same time. And as you're talking, both of you, I'm looking at the book and I'm looking at the images. It's making me think about layers of memory and how Mary Shelley was writing this in 1826, so 200 years ago, just after the year without a summer in 1817, before the 1848 revolutions, but after another pandemic, but just after
Yeah.
the French Revolution. In other words, those layers of history and trauma, collective trauma, it almost feels like your collective work on this book is somehow also mirroring unconsciously those layers of history that she was working in the interstices of it, if that makes sense. And so you're working right now on it collectively, but then I think this is the kind of book where in another 100 years or 50 years, whenever, when whatever's going to happen happens, and there'll be more layers of history that are almost veils through which to see this eventually, that you will be, what you're doing right now has almost like an intertextuality which is going to continue into the future.
I appreciate that. That was a very you thing to say. I love this of Chrissy because you're very into mind mapping, and so you're thinking about how all these things are interconnected. And I think you feel that within this book. And you feel those interventions. I think also, Chrissy, what you're saying, I'm thinking about each person's own collective history that they then bring into the image making, or the textual interventions. I think one of the things I felt strongest in the book, and it's going to sound very millennial of me to say, is I cannot imagine writing this without a computer. I'm like, I can't imagine writing this. Oh, I love this photo of Jonathan with his father. Yeah, the generational. You know, is actually the process of following the edits. And I don't think Neelis is here. Is Neelis in the room right now? Neelis is not, but Neelis ran the book through a software program to figure out redundancies throughout the text. And there aren't any, according to him. Like, you don't have the same sentence structure happening over and over again. I mean, I have a 3,000 word essay for a catalog, and I reuse like 8 sentence structures over and over again. Like, it's such a feat to have been able to produce a book like that. And piggybacking a bit off you, Chrissy, but we had talked a little bit about this book as a failure, and it's seen as a failure in relationship to Frankenstein and like what a classic canonical text it is, and that this book didn't hold up. But I think there's a certain type of ambition for this book. I don't know, I feel like if you're gonna fail spectacularly or try something different, or I felt like Shelley tried to wrap her arms around so much history, Chrissy, I think at the same time, that if it doesn't exactly land in this like very neat and tidy way, I don't perceive it as a failure, but it's not going to read to a mass audience in the same type of way. What do you think? Because you had brought up this idea of Frankenstein in relationship.
Well, I was trying to think about why, you know, as I've been rereading this book, why I think that it's a hard book to read. One of the notes that I made is that it does a lot of work with pity, so it's like very concerned to have us have experiences of pity, but it's also working with this singular character, Lionel, who in some ways is gonna, like, he's gonna be the survivor, he's gonna be the man. And in Frankenstein, you have, you have a modern Prometheus who is a monster, and who's not a model for anybody, and who's someone who cannot find a wife, and doesn't really have a family, and becomes a kind of parasite who spies on the other characters in the book. And here there's a sense of like, we're going to go to the end and we're going to have a witness, and that person is going to sort of like remain as the repository for everything. And that's a strategy that, as it's imagined in this book, doesn't really, there's a sense of doubt about that as a real strategy. And I can't, like, I would need more time with it to like tell you more about why I think this fails and the implications of the failure. But I think it's, if you're contrasting these two novels from a sort of narrative, strategic point of view, that's why one of them works and the other one doesn't work so well.
We have time for one more question.
Lucy, you said something earlier about when you were talking about collective daily practice of artists. You said something about the book providing cover, and I was wondering if both or either of you could say a little bit more about that.
You say more.
Yeah, I mean, a book can, I mean, when you write a book, like some people write by hand, some people type, whatever. I mean, you're going into a trance state for like tens, if not hundreds of hours. And that's a really strange thing to do. So that's one way a book provides cover. I mean, language is allegorical. It doesn't, it has a referential function, but that's like a very, what can I say, statistically minor, negligible part of what it does. So when you're working with that material, you're kind of opening something up, and stuff gets into the world through books. But what those things are, that's why we got interested in interpretation, because we wanted to try to figure out what those elements were, but we haven't succeeded in that, and it's an ongoing process. So I think that, yeah, that's a way. The book is, Meg was speaking about the objectness of the book, and I think that's something that we can grasp, but it's a very small part of what it is.
I also think, even if we're talking about, let's say, your book or an essay I've written, I think there's also there's the cover, and I'm also thinking about maybe the metaphor of the envelope and what it means to house the creativity and the trance that one goes into to produce, but also that encapsulates the conversations I've had with, my partner, my friends that inform the text, my editor, the publisher, all of these things that end up kind of collectively making the thing. And as we all know, the acknowledgements is the place to really, espouse all the people that went into that. And I think there's a place where, particularly exhibition making, it's always so interesting of how much it rests on the sole author, of the curator. And yet, I work at a museum of 425 people, the amount of hands on a project. There's so many people, whether it's me bouncing ideas in Chrissy's office or our team who decides this might be a cool way to hang something. It's all of these things actually speak to a much more collective process that we have. And there's so many challenges of being able to point truly to that. And I think we're in a place that a lot of people are questioning what equitable labor and the word's escaping me right now, but not even compensation, but credit really is. And so I think for me, that's a process that I'm actually particularly interested in. This is the last thing I'll say as we're wrapping up, but my first book with Studio Ella Speech Acts actually has every person on the spine. So it's all the authors, all the artists. There was a limitation, I guess. Once I did it, I was like, oh, I forgot our editor. It was who did I overlook? And we talked about, would we do that again? Putting everyone's name instead of just the curators. And we've actually resorted often to this now, where it's there's so many names, you just have, it lacks a name, you only have the title. And so I think there's also a place of, I believe in Black feminist citational practices, what it means to be influenced by that. And so, yeah, I think just trying to wrap up of saying a last note around this idea of a collective collaboration. And I think books are inherently that.
Cool. I think that's a good place to end.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Woo.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you. It's a heavy tale.
I'm oh, it's a hard book, I'm it's a slog. Thank you guys.